We have a number of existential crises at the moment. There's 55 million people that have been diagnosed with dementia today, and that number is about to explode.
Thoryn Stephens, a founder of Brain1 and former chief digital officer at American Apparel, with a background in molecular biology and biotechnology and extensive experience leading digital transformation for major brands, Thoryn brings a unique perspective on brain fitness and human optimization.
The planet has been very resilient in coming back and wiping out biodiversity to 0.1%, and life has a way. Where people talk about the existential threat of AI, that idea, that integration of biology and machines. As a biologist, biology has its limitation that you can't yet overcome. And if your brain is connected to a machine, what does that mean for your body? You're still going to need humans to manage the AI, is the point.
Do you think AI will continue to take away different functions that we thought innately belongs to humans?
I am optimistic that humans can hopefully self-preserve. If we lose that connection to nature, what does that mean for us as a species? When you're literally connecting your brain to the internet, what does that mean for consciousness? Is there a future we will be chipped, and everyone will have a chip?
Does it mean then humans are no more than just a walking computer? Welcome, Thoryn. Thank you for being here. Really excited for our conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Why don't you give listeners a quick intro of who you are and what you're up to in the world?
Sure. So my name is Thoryn. I'm based in Colorado. My background's in molecular biology and biotechnology. And of late, I've been razor focused on the concept of brain fitness and optimization. My company, Brain1, builds human health protocols. So we're looking to productize health protocols and give them away to the masses, ultimately, for different needs, ranging from things like brain fitness. It could be dementia prevention or perimenopause, as an example.
Cool. Yeah. Before we dive deeper into Brain1, which we definitely probably spend most of our time, tell me more about why did you decide to move from the science, just being a scientist, to being an entrepreneur?
Yeah, it was a careful decision. So spent the, probably first third plus of my career in biotechnology doing drug development and small molecule drug therapeutics, and loved the work. I worked with some of the most brilliant scientists in the world, and at the time was very focused on molecular biology and genomics. And, we were part of that generation that sequenced the human genome and then realized, well, what about the proteome and then specifically the transcriptome? So now my some current area of focus is in what's called multi-omics, and that's really understanding, these different processes on a cellular level and what that means for gene expression and so forth. Really loved that work. And then I've also been very interested in the areas of human optimization. And so I started doing triathlons in my 20s, began with a 10K that I ran with my mother for Susan G. Komen, and then that went to half marathons and marathons, and then all the way up to Ironmans. And it was through Ironmans that I saw that I could optimize my human biology through data. And at the time we were using Garmin's, big chunky Garmin's, and the resolution wasn't great and there was a limited number of metrics, but we would look at things like heart rate. And I would be able to see with the use of data how I could optimize my biology, so attenuate my lactic threshold so I could go further, stronger, faster, essentially. And I really began to see that I could, improve my times and so forth. And that was kind of the impetus. And then ultimately, I worked in a number of industries. I moved to LA from San Francisco, and I was working for startups and multi-billion-dollar companies, Fortune 100s.
Yep. And,
and then got into private equity and was doing private equity work where I was doing digital transformation. So taking companies at, 10 million to 100 million and really through the process of measurement of human behavior, optimizing. And reached a point in my 20s, maybe early 30s, where I could optimize any human behavior online and drive people to watch more videos or purchase more things, and realized that really wasn't my purpose in my life's calling. And was doing some pro bono work in the brain space, and what I saw was an opportunity initially starting with brain, and that ultimately what led me to the current company, Brain1.
Wow, really cool. Brain One. So what is it? Tell us more about the company, because you guys haven't launched, as you mentioned. You're about to.
Well, we've launched, we're in a closed beta, essentially. So we have a wait list of hundreds of, if not thousands of users at this stage. And, the concept is quite simple. I believe that every big idea starts quite simply. And it's the idea that humans are more efficient when they follow a structured framework of any kind. And so I saw this firsthand when I was training for Ironmans. In Ironman training, you have a series of micro habits, things that you do, swim, bike, run. And then you have your nutrition, and then you have supplementation. You're optimizing hydration, electrolytes. You could incorporate wearables and data. And if any one of those variables goes awry, then you're not going to finish your race. And so part of the beauty of training for marathons or triathlons, whatever it might be, is you're really dialing in your training. That's really the point. And so it was through that process, again, I began to see, the ways it could improve the human mind, or, like the human body fundamentally. And so really applying that concept to brain fitness. And I knew as I was going down the road, essentially developing Brain One, what I saw was that, there wasn't any essentially standardized protocols like for the masses. And that was kind of the impetus. And I really thought that there was something there that need to be explored. And so this is about 2 years ago. And then we started taking scientific papers and running them through our AI and developing these human health protocols and just giving them away. And so we've given away hundreds of protocols, and there's just, there's a tremendous amount of interest in this because you don't necessarily need to rely on pharmaceuticals. 60 to 70% of your gene expression is based on your behavior or your environment. And so that's really what we've been working on are, again, behavioral modifications protocols that anyone can follow. They're not expensive, generally don't require any money unless you're looking at, more sophisticated mechanisms of measurement. And that was really the kind of impetus for Brain One. And as we started to go down that road, I mean, even early on, I had one of my advisors, he's like, I don't know if we should call these protocols. And then literally the next week, Huberman, a Stanford neurobiologist, came up with, he launched his pre-sales of his book, which was called Protocols. So literally verbatim protocols. And so I knew we had something. And as we started to develop hundreds of these, I just, in the interest behind it, I feel we really could revolutionize human health.
So, you said you're giving out most of them for free. Like, how does that work? So what's your motivation? How does the business work at all?
Yeah. So the business model is subscription. And so people can come and get certain protocols for free. As an example, dementia prevention. So there's a hypothesis that dementia is preventable in, let's say, 30 to 40% of the global cases. There's 55 million people that have been diagnosed with dementia today, and that number is about to explode. And so you could, so basically what we do is we take a paper, and it's specifically, there's a paper called the Lancet 2020, and it identifies 12 behavior modifications, essentially, that you can follow. So these are things, many of which are environmental, like not smoking, like, your connection to other humans. And we basically take that paper and we feed it into our AI, and we get essentially standardized editorial that we then give away for free. So people can go, instead of reading, the dense scientific paper, read the editorial, and then ultimately click a button and download the protocol and follow this, basic protocol of how they can stave off dementia. And that's the basic concept.
So as a user, let's say I have any kind of potential problems with my brain function or things that I would like to improve, and then I would use Brain One to create habits, protocols, different new things that I can implement in my life. But it's not taking medication, or is it also part of that too? Like taking...
It can be, for sure. Yeah. We work with doctors that are using the platform, and then of which they would, recommend medication or supplements, and they can put that into the platform. It's just not something we would recommend because we're not a medical tool, and we don't solicit, or give medical advice, essentially. So it's based on science. We're also partnering with health influencers, athletes, and they can ultimately put their protocols online. And so we really answer a very simple question. If you've ever looked at an athlete or a health influencer and asked what is their health protocol, that's literally what we've built. So you could go and you could see, X influencer, whoever it might be, what do they do on a daily basis to keep them healthy? And so there's that, number one. So one is, you can see someone's health protocol, you can document your own, or you could go to our library and download one and then try it out for a period of time. And then we have different measures, essentially, that you could also implement as well.
And what's the relationship between a healthy body and a healthy brain? Is that the exact same, or is it different?
A great question. I mean, I would say if you take a step back and you look at a lot of the people in the space, like Huberman or Peter Attia, a lot of the longevity experts, it comes down to very basic principles, right? So, sunlight in the morning, proper hydration, sleep, literally everything revolves around sleep, as well as nutrition and so forth. So there's a lot of principles just in general health that apply to brain, but then further, there could be maybe supplements or specific things you can do to, potentially help your brain further.
And in your personal experience, have you implemented some of those, and how did that impact your?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I follow these protocols on a daily basis. I have different protocols for when I'm at home in Colorado or when I'm traveling, and so part of it is meeting people where they're at, and you want to make these protocols easy and accessible. So high level of protocol is just a routine, a series of things that you do comprised of micro habits. A micro habit is a thing that you do. An example could be cold plunging. And so cold plunging technically, could be a protocol itself, but, what is the frequency that you're cold plunging? What is the duration? What is the temperature of the water? Could be an example. And so we have a series of micro habits that then comprise the protocol, and then ultimately a series of feedback loops, generally coming back from Wearables. We also have different partners that have more advanced resolution for things like brain, as an example. So cognition or biomarkers that can tell you if you're progressing over time.
And fully relying on data could sometimes give away the agency of your own agency of, like, if you not feeling good, but your data is telling you that you're feeling great. How does that work?
Yeah, it's a great question. What we generally recommend is when you get up in the morning, like, let's say you're using an Oura ring. Do you use an Oura ring offhand?
I don't. I use a Garmin watch.
Cool. I love Garmin. I use Oura for sleep. I use Garmin for activity, different levels of resolution fundamentally. But like with Oura, they have a pretty good metric. It's an amalgamation of multiple inputs called readiness. And so you wake up in the morning. Some people go directly and they look at their Oura ring. We generally don't recommend that, because what it can do is it can bias you for the day of how you feel. It's better to get up, spend a period of time, maybe get some direct sunlight, meditation, whatever's in your daily routine, and then look at your wearable, and then, see more objectively, what does it say, and then how does that impact the way you feel? Because I mean, I've heard this empirically so many times. You get up in the morning and you're like, oh my gosh, my readiness score is 56. Oh, my day is ruined, and ultimately it biases your behavior for the day. So
you're basically prioritizing into, like, giving the space for intuition to give you a signal.
Correct.
And then backing that up, or just as a secondary variable, give it a data.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's really important too, just to check in with your body and your mind. How do you feel on that given day? Before you rely on a wearable. So, there's definitely analytics and wearable fatigue that we hear all the time, from humans, myself included. I'm a pretty connected human, all in all. And it's good to take breaks, but it's also even better to not, only rely on that data, for the aforementioned reasons.
Yeah, because with all of the data, it could be overwhelming. It's kind of like data anxiety, where it's coming from all directions, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Data fatigue, analytics fatigue, it's very much a thing.
Yeah.
And most humans have not necessarily really utilized data. I'm a data scientist. I came out of biotech, so this has been part and parcel for me from day one, really. And then as I, began to do, these longer distance endurance sports and so forth. But most humans haven't really used data on a daily basis until Aura or Garmin or Whoop. These wearables have really become, started to explode. Yeah. And so part of that is teaching humans how to use data, which is a complex undertaking. And then further, once they know how to use the data, how do you get them to come back and adhere? Yeah. So adherence is one of the metrics that, we're constantly working to optimize against.
And so most of the things that you mentioned are measuring your body biometrics, but not brain. Like, how does the brain mainly be?
Yeah, so brain is challenging, and I think it's important to distinguish between brain and mental health, right? So traditionally, most brain measurement is actually done through self-report. Quite literally. So I was visiting the Center for Brain Health out of University of Texas, Dallas, and they've been around for 30 years. They're doing awesome research. And the majority of the research that they have looked at is based on self-report, or cognition, or looking at very specific things relative to memory or executive function, and so forth. And so the newer tests that we're seeing, are actually combining maybe cognition with some level of biomarkers. And so we have a partner, they've got about 6 biomarkers. They've got cognition tests. So you can do a pre and post. So you could take a test. You could see what is your baseline today. And then after 3 months, 6 months, see, can you improve, ultimately those specific biomarkers.
It's like a subjective test?
Subjective, objective actually has both, because it has subjective, but it also has objective with blood and so forth. So you actually have specific biomarkers. So, we see that as those are the tools, really that I think will be utilized to measure brain. Traditionally mental health has all been through self-report, right? Like, how are you feeling today? So, GAD-7 is the clinical measure for general anxiety and depression. You have PHQ-9, so on and so forth. So most of the work traditionally has been through paper or self-report.
And optimization. So the question is, the body have been evolving for hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years. And then now we're finding ways how to optimize it even more.
Sure.
Why nature left so much space for improving our body and haven't done that so far?
Sure. Yeah. So sorry, what's the question?
Why do you think we still have so much room for improvement that the evolution took hundreds of millions of years to get us to where we are today?
Sure.
And now in such a short amount of time, we're finding so much extra space for improvement.
Yeah. Technology, I guess I would argue, we to the point, we've been evolving, for millions of years. Yeah. And now we have the technology to actually measure and ultimately optimize, these types of molecular processes that we never had in the past.
And where's the threshold? Or is it a moving target constantly? Like, are we haven't hit the limit of human capability of the brain or of the human hardware, basically, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely a moving target. Just the resolution of these tools alone, in our generation, it's just incredible. Again, when I began doing my triathlon training, you had these big chunky Garmins, you had one or a handful of metrics. Yeah. Now you're getting, dozens, if not hundreds of metrics out of your wearables. And that's just one example. Yeah. And then when you really think about, the evolution of the technology and, BCI as another example with brain-computer interfaces, that's absolutely, going to be the direction, in my opinion, for humanity. And there's non-invasive and invasive BCIs. We can talk about that. But, we're just scratching the surface, ultimately, of where I think we can actually go.
Would you say without the intervention of something like BCI, we are hitting the limit of human capability in terms of human brain capability, in terms of information processing? Because now there are the anxiety is let's say, a lot more common. And that's partially because we're overloaded with information, I would suspect.
Sure. Yeah, I think that we're, in some ways, scratching the surface, right? If you take a step back and, I'm thinking of doing a white paper on consciousness, right? And so consciousness and the expansion of the mind, what does that look like throughout the millennia, literally, for human beings? And if you think that, take a step back, you're looking at what are the different tools for expanding consciousness? Well, one could be prayer. people praying and believing that there's something greater. That could be an example. Another could be through meditation, ultimately. And how meditation has become, as a tool of expanding, consciousness, especially in our generations. It's proliferated, throughout the world, of course, with origins in the East.
Yeah.
And then you also think about psychedelics, right? I mean, humans have been using psychedelics for millennia, ultimately, in South America, you of course have ayahuasca and those tools. And then in North America, we have tools like peyote that the natives have been using, and so if you take a step back and you think about these different mechanisms for expanding consciousness, what does that mean for BCI? Where does BCI fall in this, right? Like over here, you're literally, and as an example, so our chief scientist at Brain One, technically it's chief brain futurist, Dr. Galen Buckwalter. Galen has 6 neural implants right now. You all have heard of Neuralink, of course. This specifically is the Blackrock Neuro Utah Array. It's a small chip. It has 8 by 8 nodes, and he has 6 of these on his brain. Wow. And these things I've seen, like I've been with him at Caltech, and I've seen these clinical trials. When I saw the photos, I mean, they took a huge, essentially chunk of his skull off, and these are not, they're pretty invasive. You got the chip connected to wires, and then he has 3 essentially PEDs on his brain. And we're at Caltech, and they're literally, screwing on interfaces and connecting his brain to the internet. So what does that mean for consciousness, right? And then expansion. Now, right now, it's only one way. We're only able to read his electrical activity. Now, to be clear, Galen is a quadriplegic. He's in a wheelchair. He's doing this work very altruistically to give back. He's not necessarily going to benefit per se, but what it's doing is, in these clinical trials, it's allowing him to measure the electrical impulses of the brain to control a robotic arm. So someday he could control a robotic arm, maybe an exoskeleton, something along those lines. Yeah. But then, further, what does that mean for the expansion of consciousness? When your brain is being connected to the internet, right now it's one directional, but at some point you can actually download, jujitsu routines just like out of the Matrix. Is that going to happen? Well, there's already quite a bit of really interesting research in that area. Yeah. And that's where it's progressing.
Fascinating.
Yeah, very, very, very interesting. And then another quick side note too, you have BCI, which people are now more familiar with because of Neuralink, but then you also have spinal computer interfaces. So again, if someone has a tragic spinal injury, similarly, can you reconnect, essentially the neurons, and what does that look like at scale? So
does it mean then humans are no more than just a walking computer?
So we are the generation that's seeing the intersection of biology and machines, like quite literally. Galen is the perfect example, right? Like leading the charge here. And so, is there a future we will be chipped, and everyone will have a chip? I mean, I think absolutely, and further, people talk about the existential threat of AI, I mean, this might be an example of, how we can maybe overcome that. That's a little controversial, but, that idea that, I mean, we're already seeing, that integration of biology and machines. Now, that said, as a biologist, biology has its limitations, that you can't yet overcome. Although there are people that are obviously trying, there's still limitations there. So I do believe we have limitations in biology. We'll be able to overcome those, probably like certain mechanisms, like the research with telomeres or DNA methylation, things of that nature that it's happening right now. Age reversal, which I think is interesting. I'm not a steadfast believer just yet, but, those types of concepts are definitely on the forefront.
Where do you stand on the belief of the spiritual realm that we have spirits and there's this ethereal domain that we are connected to?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'm a scientist at my core. That said, I've spent quite a bit of time in the jungles of the Amazon, and since I was pretty young, I drank wachuma for the first time when I was 15. And that was in the upper Amazon of Ecuador. So, I believe if you take a step back, religion traditionally is just a understanding of the unknown in many ways. You believe in spirits, you believe in God, whatever it might be. And so, I'm a little bit in the middle of those things, being a scientist, but also being, a spiritual human. I think there are absolutely energetic forces in the universe. So it's a fascinating topic, to say the least.
Yeah. Sometimes I think that the advanced technology is the one that will open the door to the spiritual realm through human brain, through human consciousness.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I would agree with that. And I think BCI is a step in that direction. When you're literally connecting your brain to the internet, what does that mean for consciousness? Quite literally, And my time, in the jungles of the Amazon, I mean, generally the strongest practitioners of these plant medicines like ayahuasca are people who have a strong history of meditation, so like Tibetan and so forth. So I've also seen that empirically. So, a lot of this work is around the stabilization of the nervous system and then allowing in that moment, the expansion. So it's quite interesting.
What do you think about uploading your mind into a computer? Is that a possibility or is that just fiction?
Well, I think now it's fiction, but, potentially in the future, the concept of digital twinning. So, some of the things that we're working towards, I mean, again, you have your DNA in genomics as an example. You then have your proteome, and your proteome is the outward expression of your DNA. And in between, you have your transcriptome, which essentially is every RNA transcript in your body, and then epigenetics or the epigenome, which essentially is the regulation, of your DNA through modifications and so forth. And it's a very fascinating time at the moment because now we can measure all of those things. So is it possible to measure them and then put them into a digital twin? Potentially. Is it still going to have the nuances of you? Right. I think over time it could be self-learning, and I think we're getting a lot closer. I don't know of much digital twinning that's incorporating what is called multi-omics. So that's again, genome, transcriptome, proteome, and so forth. But I do believe that is definitely the direction in the future.
Yeah, I see it as if yes, maybe it is possible to in the future to upload our mind, our memories, our cognition, like all of the experiences into a computer. But then there will still be something missing, that the connection, it's like we have the internet. Without the internet, we don't have access to all of the knowledge and information. And in a similar way, our spirit has a connection to the greater kind of like source energy. And by replicating your mind, you're not accounting for the connection to the source.
Right, which would be consciousness, right? I mean, you can potentially, replicate someone's mind, but where is that consciousness, And that's when general AI comes into play, which we're thinking about now. At what point does AI actually become conscious and realize that it exists, right? And that's the existential threat. Is will it then want to supersede humans and so forth?
I think there are different things: becoming conscious and tapping into, let's say, universal consciousness field of some sort.
Sure.
I don't know if it's two different things. Yes, AI maybe will at some point become, yes, I am AI and I have this body, but it might not be able to receive novel information about the universe that wasn't kind of like taken from the already existing information field.
100%. Yeah. And so where does, that consciousness come from? Ultimately, I was just in Necker Island with Branson, and I was presenting at an iconic leadership conference and explaining Brain One, and really, really awesome group of attendees. And there was a man there who said he tried DMT once, and he was a finance guy from New York, and ultimately he wrote a paper, essentially a physics paper, that was peer reviewed and is now like one of the fifth most influential paper in the history of physics. And he holds entirely accountable to smoking, trying DMT that literally, I think it was one time.
Wow.
So, where did that download come from? Was it spirit? Was it the universe? How do you begin to define that? And actually now, he said there's a number of cases where people have had, essentially head injuries and become savants in these different topics. They hit their head and they come out of a coma and they start playing the piano, like da-da-da. Quite interesting.
Wow. And do you think over time that's happening more frequently to humans? Is basically there's maybe an evolution of the field in which we exist, and we are more likely to tune into those like higher like knowledge? like that?
I would like to believe. I don't have any empirical data around that, though.
Yeah.
I would say in general, it feels like there's more of a collective consciousness. When I was going down to the Amazon at 15, I would say, and it was kind of the beginning of, the 60s were the beginning of like, widespread psychedelics with, Shulgin and Leary and so forth. It does seem like there is a, broader interest, especially over these last few years, around psychedelics and expansion of consciousness. So I'm optimistic around all those things.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, in a lot of ways it starts with prayer, and it doesn't matter what you're praying to. It doesn't even need to be anything. It could be yourself. But, just that acceptance and then just that trust, I think it's a fascinating topic.
What is your ideal case scenario future? Paint the picture for me. Like, what does that look like for humans?
Well, survival, fundamentally. We have a number of existential crises at the moment. The Earth has a propensity. I mean, we're in our sixth mass extinction at the moment. And the planet has been very resilient in coming back and wiping out, biodiversity to 0.1%. And, ultimately, life has a way. So I am optimistic that humans can hopefully self-preserve. But, we will see over these next couple decades,
Any specific ways of living? Let's say, do you see future humans live in this big cities like New York that are more sophisticated, more technologically like equipped and things like that? Or is it more like a smaller communities and deeply integrated in nature? How do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I would hope for a deeper integration into nature, to be clear. For me, I live in Colorado. I spend as much time outdoors. And so in many ways, nature is my church. That's where I really find that connectedness to source. And I would like to believe that, that is a possibility. We'll see relative to human reproduction and reproduction rates, which are generally declining. And then a lot of the chemicals that are currently in our food supply, endocrine disruption, glyphosate, PFAs, phthalates, there's a number of things that are really, in some ways, accelerating or deaccelerating health at the moment, as we're actively seeing on the planet. So,
the way I see it, the most advanced technology is the one that's least noticeable, that's deeply integrated into the background. Basically, we don't really see gadgets around us. We're just seeing nature. We see other humans. We see in beautiful environments, and technology is just on the background serving us the highest purpose for helping us to expand our consciousness, helping us to be more grounded, more centered, more present.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a beautiful depiction. Again, I think there has to be unless we're reduced, technology is reduced to zero, it's finding a way to, really become the strongest, organism that we can, which I do see as kind of that amalgamation and joining of, biology with actual machines.
And integration of AI into our lives now, we're just starting to, it's still a very new thing. What do you see the future look like for humans and AI relationship?
Yeah, I mean, we're already seeing it accelerate so quickly, right? But of course, the idea of AI agents, so, you literally have a, slew of AI agents that are doing things for you, whether it's work, whether it's play, whether it's dating, quite literally the idea of like AI agents dating each other, getting to know each other before they make the interaction. Autonomous humans, robotics, of course, also in the fray. So, we're really on the precipice for a lot of these things. I'm an optimist at heart. So I truly believe in, the positivity of the future. But it also is a bit of an unknown.
Do you think AI will continue to take away different functions that we thought it was innately belongs to humans, and AI will kind of strip away more and more of those things, and then at some point will either be left in like not knowing what we meant to do, and after some time maybe we will find what to do. But I think there will be a lot of like disruption where humans will be just kind of lost and not knowing what else am I here to do.
Yeah, I think it's a possibility. I mean, I've been utilizing AI for many, many years. When I was a chief digital officer of a major, fashion retailers at this point in my career, that was like in 15, it's almost 10 years ago now, we were using AI to, draft creative and then push it out at scale. The tools they've only gotten more, economical and, ubiquitous essentially. And so my general feeling is you need to learn these tools and adapt immediately. Like there's no reason to wait. I've been able to build my company with very little funding. I bootstrapped it myself, paid for everything to get it off the ground. And part of that has been using fractional leadership, one, and then using AI, two, for marketing specifically. But we also use AI for our protocols, and now we're using it for internal processes. And so there's an efficiency that can be gleaned there that I think is really awesome and interesting. I think that, the reality is with any AI process, not any, but most, at least how we're utilizing it, we still have a human in the loop. So as an example, we're generating hundreds, if not thousands, essentially of editorial that are based on peer-reviewed papers. So we take a paper, feed it in the AI, we get a protocol, we get an editorial. Everything is still reviewed, by a neuroscientist, by our scientific advisory board before we push it live. And so, you're still going to need humans to manage the AI is the point. So, from that perspective, while, there'll be a loss of jobs in some areas, there will also be, an increase in others. So I don't think we'll be, entirely reliant on the machines. And, I don't know, like the optimism I've heard around this argument is, could it lead to a renaissance where humans don't need to do as much, grunt labor, and we can have the machines do it, and then we can spend more time, on philosophy or what have you.
Yeah. Have you thought about where's the whole evolutionary process taking us? What is as far as you can see, future look like for physical reality, if you would say?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it is this kind of connection of the biology and the machines. And so what does that mean, in the far future, for things like space travel, of course, for things like, hibernation, how can we slow our, biological processes to a minimum to allow for things like space travel? And, the ability to, again, like download, vast amounts of data as opposed to having to learn it, organically. So I think there's a number of processes that will be accelerated and in some cases decelerated. But
the way I see what's happening is the human consciousness is becoming. So basically, humans were a lot more physically integrated into nature. We used to, or into physical reality. We used to lift heavy weights, build and grab and touch physical reality. And over time, our tools become kind of in between the physical reality and us.
Fair.
Even the way we interact with our phones, it used to be like heavy duty phones, and they become lighter and lighter. And then buttons, we don't have to press them anymore. We're just tapping them. And then at some point, it's becoming basically more and more subtle. Like we are less and less physically have a physical grip on the reality. And maybe if you extrapolate it all the way in the future, we are not physical beings anymore. We've evolved from being having a physical vessel to navigate this world. It becomes the technology can do that for us so that we can spend more time in the more ethereal domains.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting hypothesis for sure.
Yeah, it's hard to prove.
And that goes back to, again, consciousness. What does that mean? Is there, a mechanism of expanding consciousness and thereby biology? Potentially. I mean, that's quite interesting. I guess I also feel, though, there still needs, as a human, as a biological human, there's a mechanism, there still needs to be a mechanism to connect to nature. And there's research around this, the concept of grounding, your feet literally, touching the earth, of any kind, for X time, per day, X number of minutes per day. That's a micro habit we have, in the Brain One protocols, right? Is that concept. If we lose that connection to nature, what does that mean for us as a species?
Yeah.
It's definitely a
maybe the human bodies and like this monkeys in a way that just evolved to be humans will stay and be grounded and provide the platform for the consciousness to exist on the new levels of abstraction in a way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. Again, if your brain is connected to a machine, what does that mean for your body? And can that consciousness thereby become autonomous? I mean, I think that's basically what you're saying, right? Like there would be an extrapolation.
And so a little bit more on the computer-brain interface. Do you think there's a future where it's a non-intrusive, some kind of like a hat device that can now do a read and write and expand our memory?
Yeah.
And
we're seeing that now, right? So there's, within BCI, there's invasive, non-invasive. Invasive is literally Neuralink. They, drill a hole in your skull and they, put in the chip and, the prongs and so forth. In the case of Galen, they remove part of his skull and, put in the chips. And then there's non-invasive BCI, exactly what you're talking about. And there's been incredible research around this literally right now, where by putting on a cap or like an EEG type device, you can, at least get far enough where you're like typing an email. You could do it in like half the amount of time because you're actually measuring the brain activity, the electrical activity of your brain, and thereby translating it into, an email as an example. So I think that definitely is the way of the future. And I think that's how people will begin to embrace BCI sooner, actually. And I think we're starting to see hints of that. I did within EEG as an example, there's QEEG, EEG, but I did an EEG mapping at a coffee shop in Colorado. And, it showed a full profile of my brain. And that was within, it was like, 12 minutes. And I got 20 pages worth of data and, gave me a, essentially picture snapshot of where I'm at today. And, that's only going to improve. And then around the area of brain fitness and optimization, the idea of doing EEG plus biofeedback as an example. So, essentially training to strengthen your brain. I mean, there's quite a bit of research on this today, both for kind of a maintenance side, but also just, general, everyday optimization. Pretty interesting where that's going.
Yeah. As you were saying it, I saw the analogy of us mapping the Earth. Satellites used to have like a fairly low fidelity of how they can like take photos of the Earth.
Sure.
And then over time, now we have like
LiDAR.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty great. And then now we can also not only read, but from that distance, but we can write with satellite communication. We can even to the cell phone now. Like it's basically the same scale. Like if you scale it down to the human brain, it's probably a similar type of like being able to pick up such a minute signals from the space into the cell phone versus from here to little neuron.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. I mean, not too far away.
Memory, man. So how can one improve their memory? So even myself, I always look for ways how to use AI, use tools, different methods to improve memory. What are some things that you would recommend?
Yeah, there are a series of micro habits, ultimately that can be helpful for focus and memory specifically. We get asked this pretty consistently. And it's interesting. One example would be the, multitasking, right? We're taught in this culture and society, you're always like hustling, this grind culture, right? And so, you're in front of your computer and you have your cell phone and then you have the TV on in the background. I actually don't own a TV, but, for people that watch television, right? And then so you're typing, you're looking at your phone, you're looking at the TV. The human brain has not evolved to actually multitask. Generally you're doing one thing and that's hunting for food, or whatever it might be, right? And so small micro habits such as memory, improving memory through things like, not multitasking or single tasking as we call it, is massive. So like, let's say you have 3 things to do, you are more efficient with your, your brain optimization ultimately by doing one thing for 20 minutes as opposed to doing all three for 1 hour, as an example. So that's one of a very, very simple technique, that is a little bit counterintuitive to how we live, today. So that would be one. Another big one that we see is around purpose and connection, and, the importance of purpose and connection. And so when you wake up in the morning, if you have a purpose, whatever it is, it could be, gardening, it could be playing with your grandchildren, it could be, a number of things, but people who have, a purpose and wake up and, want to fulfill that purpose generally live longer. And I think it's like life expectancy. It's around between 8 and 12 years or so. And so that's really important. And so the idea of purpose, whether it's, to yourself, to spirit, to society, it doesn't matter. But as long as you have that connection, and that could be to, other humans and, playing cards or doing a weekly book club or whatever it might be, but also to yourself, ultimately. And so those are some of the tools relative to things like, memory, executive function, focus, that we essentially deploy.
So purpose is basically your attachment to life, to what happens around you, and your desire to be more involved in it, and so that enhances memory.
Yeah, or I would say connection to yourself. And that's where it really needs to start, right? Like when you wake up in the morning, I've been very fortunate. When I wake up, I'm excited to tackle the world. I'm excited to solve problems. And I always have been, since I was young. I always knew when I was like quite young, I wanted to be a scientist. And I had a friend of mine in college once, and she's like, Thoryn, how did you know? I was a double major working towards biotechnology as my undergrad degree. And I didn't understand that. I was like, how did you not? But many people haven't found that, and some people never do, or it takes them decades or many, many, many years. And so but it comes down to your connection to yourself. What do you, as a human want to give back to yourself, and then you think about your family, and then you think about, the broader, world, but you have to have that connection to yourself. And that could be through spirit. It could be through God. It could be, however you want to define it, but finding that within yourself. And, generally that's where it starts, again, yourself, your family, and then the world. But you have to define that, within yourself first.
Those who are really tapped into themselves, let's say the monks and people who have spiritual practice and things like that, I wouldn't necessarily say they have the best memory, though. I don't know. I don't know. Like, I haven't experienced enough of those people to say, like, oh, wow, he remembers everything.
Right. Yeah. I don't, let me see if I can find a study that connects it directly to memory. It's a fair point. But in general, when you're talking about brain optimization, these are some of the techniques.
What about, so now so I'm starting to use it. That's what I'm asking. Using AI as an agent that's near you and then has a reference at all of your life. And then you can inquire, and then you have a moment in time, and then you can get the memory. So is that a crutch that will maybe makes us remember even less,
Potentially. Yeah. You could, oftentimes look at your history of just your photos. You look back now, since the, really explosion of the smartphone, which I think it's like 2010, 12, roughly in that area, when smartphones became ubiquitous. You look back at those photos. So I do think that's fair. I don't know if it would mean your total memory would be less per se, but I definitely think that, that's a crux, or the opposite is a tool, that could be helpful and really having, this broader information set at your fingertips.
Because now I guess you can argue that now you don't have to remember, let's say, phone numbers of your friends. So you can use that memory to, let's say, remember where to find a photo of your friend or how to find it, or it's a different type of memorization of different thing. It's a different kind of abstraction that you're operating on.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, more of a framework. I think that's an interesting idea.
I'm actually really excited to be able to have a perfect memory recall on anything that specifically about human relationships, any conversation that I have, being able to, let's say I'm about to meet that person and get a whole rundown of what's meaningful, what we've talked about before. And then when you go back into that relationship, you're so much more already connected, and you don't have to spend time to like, oh yeah, that's right, you have kids and this,
Yeah.
like you're forgetting. This
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's a limitation on the total computational power of the brain. There's potentially not within software. So, theoretically, from that perspective, it's nearly infinite, relative to the technology versus the biology.
Anything else that you would like for the listeners to take away from this? Something that you've came across that an idea that you think are super important for people to know?
I think I was meeting with Branson this week, right? And very interesting human. He's done quite well. He's done it a little bit, with, his own way relative to business and so forth. And, we had a small group and people were asking questions and they were asking him these like really tough, complicated questions. And I had one question for him.
Yeah.
And I was like, Richard, what's your daily routine? What do you do every morning when you get up in the morning? And he's like, oh, yes, great. Because it was easy and it's something he can relate to. It wasn't like this whole existential conversation.
Yeah.
And so he told me his daily routine, and one of the first things is he gets up early. And I would just say in our research at Brain One, as we've looked at like traditional, essentially health protocols, we've looked at China, Japan, Sparta, that's very much a common theme is number one, just the idea of having a routine, but number two, getting up early as an example, as a micro habit in your routine. And so I think there's something very pronounced in documenting your health routine, whatever it is, and it doesn't need to be complex. It could be 2 or 3 things in the morning. Some of our protocols have 30 or 40 things a day, and it just depends on what type of human you are. But I think there's something, and again, it's very simple, but just starting with that, like what are the 5 to 10 things you do every day? And once you have that documented, then you could see, okay, what else do I want to do? What else do I want to learn? How do I then integrate these other things into my life, whether it's, doing more art or doing more music or spending more time with your community or your family. So that's one of the very simple things that we're really evangelizing at the moment.
Awesome, man. So share, how can people find you? Any resources you want to point people to?
Cool. Yeah, you can go to brain.one and you can join our waitlist right now. You can mention, this conversation. I'd be happy to put them to the top of the waitlist. And we'll be going fully live later this year, with the vision of, again, giving away these health protocols and then, really setting the standard for human health that anyone can follow. And then as we're gathering more and more empirical data, ultimately with the vision of optimizing health, but also consciousness.
Beautiful. Thank you, man, for being here.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, listeners, for sticking around all the way till the end. I hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I have, and I'll see you on the next one.
Pleasure.